Well, good evening, and welcome to another wonderful lecture here at the Wichita Art Museum, another fabulous iteration of our wooden lecture series. I want to begin, of course, by thanking the amazing group that makes this lecture series possible, the Friends of the Wichita Art Museum. This lecture series, this endowed lecture series, invites the best and brightest of American scholars and contemporary artists to Wichita. Thank you especially to Kelly Mumson, where did she go? The wooden lecture chair, and Joy Archer, who is chair of the Friends. Now, as if supporting this terrific lecture series weren't enough, our Friends group is also responsible for our wonderful Art on a Monday series, the annual Art and Book Fair, which is coming the first weekend in May, so mark your calendars now. And of course, I must recognize the Friends' invaluable support to the exhibition and acquisition program here at WAM. The Friends meeting is one of my favorites all year. I get to tell them about the exciting schedule of exhibitions, and they in turn tell me how excited they are about them and how they're happy to support this vision. It's probably the most concentrated 45 minutes of positive reinforcement that I get all year. I love it. So, of course, the support of the Friends also extends to our acquisition, and since their founding, the Friends have helped the museum acquire nearly 300 fantastic works of art. Most recently, they funded the acquisition of both new commissions in our art garden, Pulse Field by Derek Porter, the innovative light field installation at the front of the museum, and Windscreens by Vicki Scurry, which beautifully invokes the winds in Kansas and is positioned kind of at the corners of Pine and Stackman Drive. And of course, the Friends are responsible for the purchase of the outstanding painting East River No. 1 by Georgia O'Keeffe, which is currently on display in our permanent collection galleries. It's fitting, therefore, that Georgia O'Keeffe is our topic for the evening, and here to educate us a bit more on that seminal American artist is Cody Hartley, the Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe. Now, Cody Hartley's is a name that I've been trying to live up to for the past 8 years. I can't count how many times I've been presented with the question, do you know Cody Hartley? Let me explain. Cody received his PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2005, working with Bruce Robertson. When I arrived on that same campus to work with that same advisor, there was one name that kept coming up in conversation, Cody Hartley. See, in his time in Santa Barbara, Cody not only managed to complete a much-admired dissertation, writing on the cultivation of arts in Santa Fe, he also found time to make his mark as a curator, organizing exhibitions at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, the Reynolds Gallery at Westmont College, and eventually, for a short time, becoming the executive director of the Arts Fund in Santa Barbara. Quite an impressive record of graduate work and curatorial success in a short amount of time. And as a graduate student who dreamed of becoming a curator, I found myself following eagerly in Cody's footsteps. When I became an assistant at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, working for Cody's old boss, the wonderful Karen Sinsheimer, the first question she asked me was, do you know Cody Hartley? A few years later, working on an exhibition, I met the East Coast collector and art enthusiast Robert Dance, who immediately, after hello, and I'm from Santa Barbara, asked me, do you know Cody Hartley? By this time, I was familiar with the question and easily recognized the Cody Fan Club, a group of like-minded enthusiasts eager to discuss Cody's brilliance. And I mean that earnestly. Cody is not only a talented scholar, a thoughtful administrator, and a forward-thinking museum professional. He blends those rare talents with humor and charisma. As a perfect example, the last line from Cody's bio reads, quote, raised in Wyoming, Cody lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he is slowly recovering from years of green chili deficiency imposed while living in New England. His fans, of which there are many, always comment on his skills and savvy. These characteristics moved Cody from Santa Barbara to New England, specifically the Clark Institute, where he worked as an assistant curator of American art beginning in 2007. From there, he transitioned to the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, working as a curator in the Art of the Americas department from 2008 to 2011, during which time the new Art of the Americas wing was installed. Cody's talents were quickly recognized, and he moved from the curatorial department at the MFA Boston to the executive suite, becoming the director of the gifts of art. In 2013, he left MFA Boston and was named the director of Curatorial Affairs at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, a position that he has held for 3 years. As Cody was rapidly climbing the ladder of the museum world, that echo, "Do you know Cody Hartley?" was sounding more and more at art history conferences, private events, and email exchanges with colleagues. It's another one of Cody's talents, creating a circle of colleagues, leaving friends and admirers, all eager to connect and eager to find others who know the talented Cody Hartley. His talent not only is evident in his past positions, but also his impressive record of scholarship. He's written about Maria Martinez, Frederick Remington, New Mexican devotional images, and I love this title, by the way, True Illusions in Soft Painting, an essay from the Clark Institute exhibition catalog like Breath on Glass, Whistler, Innis, and The Art of Painting Softly, which was the recipient of the 2009 William Fishelis Book Award. Tonight, Cody will share with us new scholarship on Georgia O'Keeffe, which will be published in an upcoming catalog for an exhibition. And I could go on, but I'll stop there so that you too can get to know Cody Hartley.
Oh my, I'm blushing. That was the most generous, thoughtful, and entertaining introduction I've ever had. Thank you, Lisa. I had no idea that Santa Barbara remembered me so well. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm so thankful to the friends, to Lisa, to Patricia, to the staff here for inviting me and hosting me. I've had a wonderful visit so far and look forward to spending some time with you this evening, sharing information about a remarkable artist and individual. I want to start by asking you a few questions, a few questions for the audience. Beginning with a bit of kind of idea association. When you think of Georgia O'Keeffe, what place or places come to mind? It's pretty uniform, isn't it? There might be a few people saying New York, Lake George. Otherwise, it's pretty much New Mexico. How many have visited the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe? Yeah, we've been asking this question every time we do a talk, and it's pretty amazing. It's kind of heartwarming to see the reach that O'Keeffe and her legacy have. Have any of you been to the home and studio at Abiquiu? Still a few, yeah. It's an amazing place, and if you find yourself in New Mexico, please do make a reservation to see the home and studio. It gives you an insight into the deep thought she put into all aspects of her life. It's a very enjoyable visit. Have any of you been to the landscapes at Ghost Ranch, her other home in New Mexico? A handful. Though it's only about 20 minutes away, it's a starkly different landscape, and you can really see why she would have two homes, basically a summer and winter home, so close together. It's like living in two different places. I start with these two quotes, one from O'Keeffe herself and one from Wendell Berry. I will come back to these, but these kind of trace the arc or two poles of what I'll be discussing tonight. The distinctions between a sense of place and the importance of understanding one's place, and O'Keeffe's own kind of comment seeming to disclaim that importance. What would you think if I asked the question, where is Georgia O'Keeffe, instead of who is Georgia O'Keeffe? Georgia O'Keeffe and northern New Mexico are inextricably linked in the minds of many. The region is frequently referred to as O'Keeffe country, much to the chagrin of the Pueblo Indians and other Native American residents whose forebears called this land home for millennia, and to the recently arrived, the last 400 years, Hispanic population, which traces its origins to the conquest of the region in the 17th century. O'Keeffe herself, I'm certain, would have been the first to dismiss the idea of O'Keeffe country. One imagines that O'Keeffe, who masterfully integrated herself into the community as a respectful and decent neighbor, rather than imposing herself as the great and famous celebrity artist, would have been annoyed at the very notion of giving naming rights to an individual who only moved permanently to the state in 1949. Still, for many living outside of New Mexico, her paintings of the dramatic landscape are emblematic. Her nearly mythical reputation as a staunchly independent woman living alone in the remote high desert can overshadow all else about this complicated place known as New Mexico, and the association between O'Keeffe and the land that she portrayed is enduring. But this is not the only place that shaped O'Keeffe and held significance for the artist. She lived, in fact, in many locations across the United States before that permanent move to New Mexico in '49, when she was in her early 60s. Moreover, she was intrepid, exploring her immediate environment and enthusiastically traveling to more distant destinations. Even when nominally settled in a given location, she was constantly moving, on foot, on horseback, by train, by plane. Considering O'Keeffe's relationship to place, or rather to many places, over her long lifetime, offers a rewarding and productive set of contradictions to explore. What follows this evening is a consideration of the importance, not just of place, but of those intentional disruptions and transitions created by travel, a kind of creative dislocation as essential to O'Keeffe's art and life. Like the hardy crops on the farmlands surrounding her childhood home in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, O'Keeffe established roots wherever she made her home. She also, however, thrived upon frequent transplantations, adapting to radical changes in geography and climate. The contrasts between the various regions of the U.S. in which she lived, including the Midwest, the Southeast, the West, Texas, New York, New Mexico, could not be more stark. It's not merely a matter of different scenery or the difference between urban and rural areas. In meaningful ways, everything about these places was different, and she took something productive from each of them. O'Keeffe's early life and career comprised a series of moves, punctuated by personal and career disruptions and familial tragedies, including the loss of her mother. Already, by her 13th birthday, she was living about 15 miles away from her family's farm as a boarding student at Sacred Heart Academy in Madison, Wisconsin. By the time she moved to New York City in 1918 to live with Alfred Stieglitz when she was 30, she'd lived in more than a dozen locations, from large cities, New York and Chicago, to small communities in Virginia, South Carolina, and as far west as the Texas Panhandle. Moreover, she'd moved back and forth between various communities several times, pursuing educational opportunities or work, including short-term teaching assignments, often just for the summer, since those were the only times a woman was allowed to teach at the college level at that point in the school she was working at. Her family was unable to support her financially. Being unmarried, she was entirely self-reliant during her 20s. She managed at this time to travel also to Colorado via New Mexico, seeing the Rocky Mountains in 1917 and giving her the first glimpse of the region that would come to absorb so much of her attention in subsequent decades. O'Keeffe's time in New York and New Mexico, and her traversing between these two poles, is best known, in part because the journey has become a geographic proxy for her relationship with Alfred Stieglitz. However, even New York and New Mexico are not singular locations, but represent a series of different homes, networks, and geographies which she enjoyed across a seasonal rhythm. There were, over the years between 1918 and 1949, 3 apartments in New York City, plus the sprawling rural retreat of Lake George, where O'Keeffe and Stieglitz spent their summers and often stayed long into the autumn. The site housed a number of buildings, as well as gardens, orchards, and access to paths for exploring the surrounding woods and mountains. I seem to have gotten ahead of myself, excuse me. In New Mexico, oh no, I'm not, I'm right on schedule. In New Mexico, O'Keeffe spent her first few visits between 1929 and 1936, staying with various friends, before establishing her first home in 1936 at Ghost Ranch, which is on the lower right, actually, followed by a second at Abiquiu on the upper left. This created what would effectively become summer and winter homes, only a short distance apart, but offering distinctly different geographies. Ghost Ranch is arid and dry, dramatically situated on an isolated desert plain at the base of colorful sandstone cliffs. That's what we're looking at on the upper left. With little water and alkaline soil, only sagebrush and scrub can thrive. Abiquiu, on the lower right, we're looking down the Chama River Valley from above kind of the edge of the eastern edge of the Colorado Plateau. So as we're coming from Ghost Ranch towards Abiquiu, looking down the Chama River. So this lush area down here is where Abiquiu is, and this distant mesa edge there is the view she has out of her bedroom at Abiquiu. Abiquiu is an ancient village on a bluff overlooking the lush fields and green ribbon of trees that trace the route of the Chama River as it flows towards the Rio Grande. The hints of a seasonal existence had begun to emerge in O'Keeffe's life as early as the 1910s, as she pursued teaching opportunities and adapted her life to the academic calendar. This migratory pattern was then firmly established as part of her life with Stieglitz. After her discovery or rediscovery of New Mexico in 1929, O'Keeffe defined her own seasonal pattern, spending most summers in New Mexico and returning to New York for the winter, until she permanently relocated in 1949, 3 years after Stieglitz's death. Even then, she split her time between those two homes, Abiquiu and Ghost Ranch, frequently traveling the 15 miles that separated them. Interspersed among stays at these many semi-permanent residencies was constant travel and movement. New York summers were broken up by trips up and down the eastern seaboard to Maine, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. Occasionally, trips took her further afield, Canada, Bermuda, Hawaii. Here you have this great image of her on the shores at Hawaii. And if you happen to know her work very well, you might recognize this lava bridge back here, which she drew and painted several times. Even after making the long journey from New York to New Mexico, once there, she immediately took to exploring the region. Her New Mexico summers were punctuated by trips across the West. During her first, in 1929, she went west into Arizona to see the Grand Canyon, taking roads that she described as terrible across, quote, cruel, cruel country. North from there to Bryce Canyon in Utah, and then east to Colorado Springs, before looping back to the town of Taos, where she was staying with Mabel Dodge Lujan. Covering a distance of nearly 1,500 miles, this would be a trying road trip on today's well-maintained highways, to say nothing of the advantages of air conditioning. In 1937, a few years after discovering the house she would eventually purchase at Ghost Ranch, she again explored Colorado, Utah, and Arizona, now driving her own Ford and traveling with a small group that included photographer Ansel Adams. This is just a fun photo. This is not actually her car, and you know that because you can see the Ghost Ranch logo, but this is part of the group that traveled with her while she was driving her own car. The following year, she traveled with this group to California to spend more than 2 weeks backpacking deep into Yosemite National Park. And this is one of Ansel Adams' photos of the group at camp. This is Georgia leaning in, checking on the cooking. In these years, she would also frequently make the 300-mile round-trip journey west from her home in New Mexico at Abiquiu to the isolated Black Place, a dramatic lunar landscape of black and gray hills where she would camp and paint. She wanted to camp so she could be there the moment the sun rose. Regardless of the freezing storms or blistering heat, she loved going to the Black Place. So you get some sense of the unusual landscape, but then you also see her, making camp. While she made her home in New Mexico for the last 37 years of her life, O'Keeffe continued to explore near and far, traveling frequently across the U.S. and internationally. In the late 1940s, she traveled to Arizona to see Frank Lloyd Wright's winter home in Arizona, Taliesin West, and to Nashville to oversee the installation of the Stieglitz collection given to Fisk University. In the 1950s, she made her first international trip, driving to Mexico City to visit fellow artists and friends Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, and Miguel Covarrubias, and to tour the Yucatan Peninsula. Subsequent international trips included visits to France and Spain, Peru, and Oaxaca. She joined a small group for a 3.5-month world tour in 1959, which took her across India, on to Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, and Pakistan. And then Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel, before concluding in Rome. She claimed after this trip that, quote, she should have seen enough to satisfy me for the rest of my life. Clearly, it was not enough. Just a year later, in 1960, she was on the road, in the air, I should say, again, visiting Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Cambodia, and the Pacific Islands on a 6-week trip. These trips, here are just a few snapshots of her on various world trips. I love her here on camel. These trips were memorialized in travel boxes that she created to hold her souvenirs. There we go. Alongside these global forays, O'Keeffe was also traveling back and forth to New York and other cities to oversee exhibitions of her work. Throughout the rest of the 1960s, she continued to travel internationally while also making several trips to raft the Colorado River, her last being in 1970 at the age of 82. This is one tough woman. This impressive catalog of destinations and the constant motion and travel of a kind of supremely peripatetic life might seem at odds with an artist whose work has become so strongly associated with just a few key locations: West Texas, New York, being both New York City and Lake George, and of course, New Mexico. Many of the modernist artists associated with Stieglitz expressed a particular interest in understanding and conveying the distinctive character of a given region, capturing what has been referred to as a sense of place. Painter and poet Marsden Hartley, no relationship unfortunately for me, had Maine and Cape Ann, Massachusetts. Arthur Dove created poetic visual symphonies based upon his experience of Long Island, New York. But perhaps none have been linked with a specific American landscape and places as strongly as O'Keeffe. In part, this is an accident of autobiography and art historical interpretation. O'Keeffe herself, in her later years, emphasized her life in New Mexico. She spoke less of the years in Texas or Lake George. And even when she did speak of these locations, some of her comments were understood as disparaging, conflating her complicated relationship with Alfred Stieglitz and his family with her time in Lake George, reducing it to a string of annoyances and frustrations. Late comments made where she said things like, quote, "I'm enduring the green," and a statement made in the 1970s asserting that Lake George was, quote, "not really painting country," seem to have further encouraged scholars and biographers to reduce the entire Lake George experience to a trial to be endured before O'Keeffe ultimately found her place in New Mexico. In opening her 1976 autobiography, O'Keeffe explicitly dismissed the importance of where and how she'd lived. It seems that many O'Keeffe biographers and scholars took her at her word. But this conventional wisdom is being reconsidered by a new generation of writers. As the research of curator Aaron Coe in a recent exhibition and catalog called Modern Nature about the time at Lake George has demonstrated, by returning to the documentary evidence, O'Keeffe's letters, her comments made during the 1920s while actually at Lake George, and the visual evidence of the work produced during those years, the most productive decade of her life, it is clear that O'Keeffe found this region of the Adirondack Mountains incredibly stimulating and artistically productive. In Texas, art historian Amy von Lintel has questioned the long-standing assumption that O'Keeffe's time in Texas, where she taught in several communities between 1912 and 1918, was merely a detour before she met Stieglitz and her career could really begin. By returning, like Coe, to documentary evidence, von Lintel has revealed the full glowing energy of O'Keeffe's time in Texas, discovering a confident, energetic young O'Keeffe who immersed herself in the landscape and in her teaching career, developing deep and meaningful relationships, some romantic, she did like to drive with boys, and who was, by all accounts, a vibrant and enthusiastic member of the communities in which she lived and worked. O'Keeffe's dismissal of the importance of where and how she lived also seems at odds with the substantial energy invested by O'Keeffe in her homes. From her boarding house rooms in Texas, where she tried to re-wallpaper and repaint the rooms, to her apartments in New York City, from the shanty, her studio at Lake George, through Ghost Ranch and Abiquiu, we see an evolution and perfection of specific ideas about how to live, how to work, and how to structure one's home to facilitate an artistic practice. As nearly 10,000 visitors a year discover upon visiting her home in Abiquiu, here we have a couple of shots of the interior, the kitchen on the upper left, her bedroom, upper right, the dining room looking into the living room or sitting room on the lower left, and then the sitting room itself with this amazing picture window out onto a tamarisk tree, kind of framed like a Japanese print in the living room. O'Keeffe's houses were as much expressions of her creativity and modernist aesthetic as her artworks. More and more, myself and my colleagues, as we work with the homes and their contents, are realizing that they're one of her greatest artworks. She used a minimalist color palette, white and other neutral tones, a practice that started at least as early as 1917 when she painted the walls of a room in Canyon, Texas. In her New York apartments in the 20s and 30s, furnishings were spare, often covered in white slipcovers. You can just see the corner of a couch here that has a slipcover on it. She still, at the end of her life, was covering all the furniture with white slipcovers. There's nothing frivolous. Nothing frivolous appeared, and it really feels like it's a repudiation of the Victorian aesthetic of her youth. This Spartan aesthetic from the homes in New York, of course, was continued in New Mexico. At Lake George, she established her studio in a former barn, away from the main Stieglitz home. This separate space served her well and established a lifelong preference for segregating her working space from the main house. At Ghost Ranch, and I'm showing you a floor plan here, and I'll walk you through it in a second, she closed off a doorway, disrupting the originally interconnected circuit of rooms. So when she took over the house, it had been built by the owner of Ghost Ranch, and she started staying in it as a guest. And then when the owner's wife ran off with a tutor, he no longer really was interested in the house, and O'Keeffe took it off his hands for him. Originally, the house had a doorway here and was open, so you could walk from one end of the house all the way to the other, and there was a doorway here too. O'Keeffe closes this doorway off, puts a sink in front of it. This is a closet, and this is essentially crossing through the bathroom, so it's not a thoroughfare really. So therefore, this studio, small sitting room, and what she turned into her bedroom are completely isolated from the rest of the house. In order to get into this section of the house, you have to go back outside to the open air patio. With that change, it became necessary to be outdoors in order to access her studio and bedroom. The other great thing is you'll notice a doorway here in her bedroom, and there are plate glass windows in many places that she inserted to give her a view out onto the landscape. She went furthest at Abiquiu, and now I'm showing you a footprint of Abiquiu, putting her studio and bedroom in a separate building entirely, completely detached from the rest of her home, where guests and staff could go about their daily activities without interrupting the artist. So when she first discovers Abiquiu, it's an adobe ruin kind of melting back into the earth. She's taken by the courtyard, which has that famous black door that she painted many times, and the garden that's over here. She wanted to have a garden, and Ghost Ranch was too arid to support gardening. And this house was on an irrigation ditch and had water rights. This building was a former carriage house, a barn basically. She liked barns. And she remodeled it and renovated it, making it her studio, the large portion, a bathroom, and then a small bedroom. And just like the house at Ghost Ranch, the bedroom has plate glass windows, corner windows, and a doorway walking out into the landscape. So she could wake up and immediately walk into the land. Her New Mexico houses exhibited other shared features. Those large plate glass windows, unusual in homes in the 1940s, particularly those with unreinforced adobe construction, which has caused us some headaches, and corner windows in her bedrooms, which afforded sweeping vistas to the northwest and northeast, respectively, at Ghost Ranch and Abiquiu. So here you can see this is actually the breakfast nook at Ghost Ranch with the same kind of window. This is her bedroom at Abiquiu from the outside. You can see the large plate glass windows down the wall here. And this is the view from her bedroom looking out to that mesa I pointed out in that earlier photo of the Chama River Valley. Her own words aside, where and how O'Keeffe lived is important. O'Keeffe did not live just anywhere, and the places in which she spent most of her time shaped her career and identity. Beyond the numerous places she lived during her teens and early 20s, the selection of which was driven first and foremost by educational and career opportunities, and secondarily by family considerations, the poles of her adult existence were New York and the Southwest. One was the undisputed cultural and artistic capital of the U.S., home to the collectors, galleries, and museums most significant for establishing and sustaining a professional artistic career. The other was, still in many ways, a frontier, a remote and dramatic landscape, largely undeveloped and unpeopled. It had a vitality and energy quite different from that of the urban metropolis, wild and windy, rough and remote. Both Texas and New Mexico retained some of the features of the romanticized mythical West that O'Keeffe read about as a schoolgirl. Cowboys and cattle drives, booms and busts, prairie, desert, and rock. In New Mexico, those people who did occupy the land, both indigenous and Hispanic, interested O'Keeffe and represented distinctly different cultural values. There were just enough Easterners, artists and writers, along with wealthy tourists or part-time residents, that one might enjoy an evening of urbane discussion, the equal to be had of any to be had in New York, if that was desired. Wealthy patron of the arts Mabel Dodge Lujan, escaping New York City to find a utopian alternative in the town of Taos, did nothing so well as recreate her Greenwich Village salon in the desert. And if one wished to escape the conversations, it was easy enough to completely avoid that crowd, driving off into the dust, removing to a place like Ghost Ranch. Everywhere she lived, O'Keeffe interacted with diverse people, enjoying varied cultural traditions, while also having an impact on those she met. Repeatedly, one finds recollections of how distinctive O'Keeffe's personality and style were, but also about the positive impact she had as a teacher, a friend, a neighbor. O'Keeffe navigated both New York and New Mexico society with dexterity. She handled wealthy collectors and patrons with aplomb. There are amusing anecdotes recording the way O'Keeffe would manage and subtly manipulate visiting collectors by offering only a few works, sometimes suggesting that a particular artwork was not really available, but certainly heightening desire until she relented and sold the formerly unavailable work for a much higher price. There are also, however, accounts of deep, lasting friendships with collectors that far surpass the bonds of a commercial transaction. At the same time, she exhibited great savvy and cultural understanding as she negotiated the complicated social politics of the village of Abiquiu, where residents traced their lineage and land ownership back to the 60 families originally named when the land was granted by the Spanish governor in 1754. She was by all means and all definitions a newcomer. She was a gracious host to her guests, be they museum directors such as Daniel Catton Rich of the Art Institute of Chicago, seen here enjoying a beer on the patio at Ghost Ranch, or a group of neighborhood kids, such as were photographed during dinner at Abiquiu in 1960. New York and New Mexico each allowed O'Keeffe to define a certain personal and professional identity, while developing different aspects of her artistic practice. In the 1920s, with her time split seasonally between New York City and Lake George, O'Keeffe developed and honed her subject matter, her approach to painting, and her professional identity. It is this decade in which she is most closely collaborating with Stieglitz, masterfully launching exhibitions of her work and managing critics and the press, an activity best done in New York City. You might have seen this, I'm not sure. It's a fairly well-known painting at a museum in Wichita. She painted dramatic views of the city skyline, a leitmotif for many of the modernists, expressing the confidence of the modern city, and distinctive as the single most recognizable visual characteristic of North American cities like New York and Chicago, as opposed to older European cities. Looking out across the city from her apartment, or capturing the skyline, she employed thoroughly modern compositional strategies to convey the energy and dynamism of the city. It was at Lake George, however, that she found the subjects that brought her widespread critical and popular acclaim. From the hill overlooking the lake and surrounding gardens, orchards, and woods, she found the flowers, trees, leaves, and landscapes that dominate her output in the 1920s. To be clear, it's not her subject matter that brought her this recognition. Her subjects could not have been more conventional. Rather, it's what she did with that material, coming to terms with abstraction, incorporating a modern sense of spiritualism based in the experience of the natural world, and developing a powerfully modern sense of composition, which played with scale and successfully overturned formulas for cohesive compositions. She took the conventional wisdom about composition and turned it on its ear. Diagonals, zooming in, blowing up subjects so they spilled beyond the edge of the canvas. The magnified flowers, spilling across and beyond the canvas edge, reflected a new and different sensibility, which had more in common with avant-garde photography than traditional painting. This is not surprising, considering the important work done at Lake George was often completed in dialogue with Stieglitz, the leading proponent for modern photography. The release and publication in 2011 of the first volume of their correspondence shed fresh light on their complicated relationship, making it clear that despite many frustrations, and there were many, they had an abiding love that was grounded and sustained by their shared artistic, creative, and intellectual pursuits. Her work in the 1920s also reflects deep knowledge of the latest ideas in art in both Europe and in the US, while reflecting a specific and unique individual style. New York and New Mexico represented two distinct poles within a contemporary dialogue about national culture. During the 20s and 30s, as O'Keeffe came to prominence, modern artists in the U.S. were deeply concerned with identifying something authentic and distinct upon which they could build a national culture. They sought subjects that conveyed the energy of modern life and the civic ambitions of the American people, from skyscrapers to the advanced industrial plants churning out new consumer goods like Ford automobiles. They also looked to individual regions where the people and landscape expressed something unique and original that might distinguish the U.S. from other nations. This search for a national art was occurring in many places, particularly for former colonies, which had long lived in the shadow of European artistic culture. The desire to differentiate and establish a valid national culture was strongly felt. Stieglitz was a foremost proponent of cultural nationalism, and in O'Keeffe he found an artist who seemed to have unparalleled qualifications as an authentic American. She'd been raised on a Midwestern farm, trained only in North American schools, and she was living and working in West Texas when they first corresponded. He could conceive of her as being free of the influence of European training. In truth, O'Keeffe's intellectual curiosity and ambition ensured that she was fully aware of the latest ideas emerging from the artistic centers of Europe. Nonetheless, the idea of a woman artist emerging from native soil was compelling, which, reinforced by her emphatically modern American depiction of subjects such as New York City skyscrapers, played into the generalized hunger for an American art. It was in New Mexico, however, that O'Keeffe made her most distinct contribution to defining a national culture. O'Keeffe was not the first modern artist to paint New Mexico. In fact, it had already been a destination for artists from the East Coast, modern or otherwise, and had been since the end of the 19th century, when the Taos Society of Artists first began creating their highly romanticized paintings of Native American life in the New Mexican landscape. Prior to O'Keeffe's arrival, important modern artists, including Marsden Hartley, Stuart Davis, others, had visited and worked in New Mexico, mostly at the invitation of Mabel Dodge Lujan. John Marin was also in residence at Lujan's compound during O'Keeffe's first summer visit in 1929. Already then, when O'Keeffe arrived, the Southwest had been identified as a region with potential for invigorating American culture and defining an art distinct from European precedents. In a series of essays published between 1918 and 1922, Marsden Hartley proposed that the Native American culture could provide the inspiration for establishing an authentic national culture and resolving a perceived spiritual and aesthetic poverty in the U.S. Yet it was arguably O'Keeffe's unique vision of the New Mexico landscape and her innovative and unusual incorporation of bones into her paintings that most firmly established New Mexico and the Southwest in the public imagination. She was aware that she was responding, almost tongue-in-cheek, to a yearning for a nationalist artwork. Much later in life, in her 1976 autobiography, she recalled the anxiety expressed by artists and writers about creating what she called the great American thing, be it the great American novel, the great American play, or the great American painting, which seemed ironic to her, given how focused so many of those folks were on Europe. She wrote, quote, "Cézanne was so much in the air that I think the great American painting didn't even seem a possible dream. I had driven across the country many times. I was quite excited over our country and knew that at that time almost any one of those great minds would have been living in Europe if it had been possible for them. They didn't even want to live in New York. How was the great American thing going to happen?" Her answer was to paint a blatantly patriotic image, a cow skull against a red, white, and blue backdrop. The use of bones was unexpected, and as handled by O'Keeffe, completely original. The depiction of skulls in artworks has a long history, of course, within the tradition of memento mori, those memories of death. But the artist denied such historical references and dismissed morbid associations with death. Instead, these were abstract objects for her, described, quote, as beautiful as anything I know. Described by her, quote, as beautiful as anything I know. During her first summer in New Mexico, O'Keeffe became fascinated with the bleached white bones she found scattered about the desert. She shipped some of them back to New York as a souvenir of the region, an entire barrel of them. In fact, many of the best-known paintings of bones, the very works that seemed iconically New Mexican, were painted in New York City during the long winter months following her visits to New Mexico. This includes cow skull, red, white, and blue, as well as horse's skull with white rose. The same is true for many of the New Mexico landscapes. Conceived of during the summer, many of these were actually finished in New York from sketches completed on location. The idea of Georgia O'Keeffe painting her iconic New Mexico subjects from her New York City apartment seems a fitting vision of an individual whose existence and comprehension of her world was based upon a productive balance of rootedness and disruption, location and dislocation. The only thing that seems as constant as motion throughout her life is her drawing practice. And it's not accidental that the two are often done in tandem. Travel and exploration, like sketching, were key to O'Keeffe's way of knowing both place and self, of observing and belonging. Through more than 700 sketches and drawings housed at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, it becomes clear that sketching was O'Keeffe's primary way of familiarizing herself with the visual character of a place. Anytime she went somewhere new, she started getting to know it by making a sketch. While she carefully maintained and preserved these sketchbooks throughout her life, there is little sense of chronological or geographic organization. It appears that she simply grabbed the nearest sketchbook, opened to an unused page, and started drawing. Studying them is a bit like traveling with O'Keeffe. Familiar places emerge and recur, interrupted occasionally by something new and different. In these sketches, as in the finished works, which can often be linked back to particular drawings, O'Keeffe began the process of making a place her own, giving it meaning through her distinct vision. In doing so, she made these places visible and knowable in profound ways. These are hard to see because they're light pencil sketches on paper, and I apologize. This thin drawing is an outline of the cliffs behind her house at Ghost Ranch. This is the road leading up to the Pedernal, the mountain she could see from her patio and painted often. And then there is a painting that matches this composition exactly. So these lines on the outside, the squares defining her final composition. This is very similar to the sketch she gave the Ghost Ranch, which they continue to use as their logo. And this is fun. This is the Ranchos Tataos Church, a very famous subject photographed by Ansel Adams and many others, and painted by many artists, but perhaps none as well as O'Keeffe. Part of her practice was to start with a line drawing, something like this, where she's just getting the outline and the critical elements on paper, and then move to a drawing like this, where she's working more on form and mass and volume. For many visitors to the O'Keeffe home in Abiquiu, this point about making places visible and knowable in profound ways is made explicit as they stand at the northeast corner of the house, where her bedroom looks out across the Chama River Valley and towards the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the east. A highway runs along the base of the hill beneath her home. To most, it's just a highway. To O'Keeffe, who saw the abstract visual line of the road clearly, it was much more. She wrote about it, quote, "The road fascinates me with its ups and downs and finally its wide sweep as it speeds toward the wall of my hilltop to go past me. I began drawing and painting it as a new shape." End of quote. And that sense that she's looking out into the land and she's not seeing roads and mountains, she's seeing shapes. She's seeing lines. She's seeing the world already transformed into an artistic work. Once we've seen this vision, this vista, through O'Keeffe's artwork, it's impossible to ever see it again in the same way. The road is forever after seen as a flowing calligraphic line across the land. This is actually O'Keeffe's own photo taken in the winter from her bedroom of that same road. And this is a painting from the National Gallery's collection where you can see the kind of sweep of that road. This is a subject she returned to many times, often in photography. O'Keeffe saw her surroundings with remarkable clarity and a perception honed by experience and a disciplined practice. A practice of looking and making artworks naturally, but also a practice of exploration and travel. Intentional dislocation provided essential creative stimulation. Her abiding ability to understand and convey the very essence of place, of a specific location, was equaled and sustained by her intrepid spirit, helping us see our world differently, with a fresh perspective, is one of the great gifts artists offer. Georgia O'Keeffe's understanding of place, of many places, was hard-won and is part of her lasting legacy and gift. Thank you. One of the joys of my life living in Santa Fe and working with the O'Keeffe materials is the natural beauty that surrounds me. And I love to spend my weekends exploring the hills and hiking and driving around. And as I was preparing this talk, I've been thinking a lot about O'Keeffe's intrepid spirit. So I just last week was driving north of Ghost Ranch right after a snowstorm, looking to the south to the Pedernal covered in snow and thinking how fortunate I am to live in this amazing place and explore these back roads and byways. And I started looking through images from our archive, and we have several thousand photos, so I have yet to look at every one of them, and found these 3 photos taken by O'Keeffe of different roads. And I thought they were just brilliant. We don't often think of her as a photographer, but she was quite a skilled photographer. I think she'd had some good teaching. She knew a couple of fairly decent photographers. And she arranged these in such a way with this composition where the view is split right down the center that is such a standard part of her approach to painting. And to see an artist move between media but express similar ideas, I think, is really insightful. So I just stumbled upon these and loved it and thought this was the perfect way to conclude a talk about O'Keeffe and location and dislocation with an invitation to the open road. I think we have a few minutes. I'd love to answer any questions if you'd like to ask away. Yes?
Where are the Black Hills?
Yes, the Black Place is about 300 miles west. It's towards the Navajo Nation. Part of the land is actually Navajo Nation owned. It's near Chaco Canyon, if you know that area. So it's still in New Mexico. And it's a small, concentrated area with this just amazingly unusual lunar landscape based on the way the soils and clays have evolved from the water runoff. Other questions? Yes?
Did O'Keeffe write a lot? Did she keep journals and diaries?
She did. She claimed that she disliked words. They weren't trustworthy. She often expressed frustration that she couldn't make her words communicate the things she wanted to say. That's what color was for. So she felt more comfortable expressing herself through art. That said, she wrote a lot, and her writing is amazingly beautiful, incredibly poignant quotations. The letters with Stieglitz, it's remarkable. The two of them, in some cases, were sending letters back and forth 3-4 times a day. In some cases, these are letters that are 15, 20, 30 pages long. Clearly, the Postal Service was operating in a different style at that point. It's the way we use email, they were using letters. but more voluminous. And they express everything. I mean, I think for many people, reading the first volume of letters was a revelation. It can be shocking. There are parts that are incredibly beautiful and meaningful. There are parts that are surprisingly explicit, making all details of their relationship very obvious. But it's a joy to read because they're both very good writers. There's a lot of unpublished writing out there still, and it's not in my hands yet, but I know where it is, and I will get it eventually. Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yes.
On her world travels, did she ever do any painting of such places as India?
You know, it's interesting. She really didn't do much. There are paintings inspired by her trips to Peru. There are paintings that are partially inspired by views she had from airplanes as she was flying over China and other places. The cloud paintings that she did late in life, including the very large cloud that's in the Art Institute of Chicago, the sky above clouds, those were inspired by her experience of flying during those international trips. She would sketch, but she did very few paintings during travel itself. More often, the travel stimulated an idea that emerged in artwork later. Hawaii was one exception. That was relatively early on, and she was commissioned to go to Hawaii to paint for the Dole Pineapple Company. They should have known better than to hire O'Keeffe. You don't tell her what to do. So I'm trying to remember what it was. The first painting she sent back for their commission was, I'm forgetting what fruit it was, but something completely different, not related to a pineapple. And the advertising director had kind of come up with this idea to have a famous artist paint pineapples. It's like, but I need pineapples. So ultimately, when she was back in New York after this 3-month junket to Hawaii, they sent her a pineapple to her apartment. And she said, I'm not painting that mushy old thing, forget it. That campaign didn't work well for them. Yes?
How much of the collection is privately owned and how much is in the O'Keeffe Museum and others?
Yeah, so the Catalogue Raisonné, which is a large document kind of summarizing all the known works produced by O'Keeffe, lists a couple thousand things between paintings, drawings, everything else. Our collection includes 140 paintings, 700 drawings, then a number of photographs and other things. She gave a significant number of her best works to museums across the country during her lifetime. She was very savvy, and she knew that having her works represented in major collections was good for her legacy and reputation. So there are something like 30 in Milwaukee. Chicago has 20-some. The National Gallery has quite a few. The Met, the MFA Boston, Philadelphia, they all have a dozen or more. And then there are still quite a few in private hands. They're definitely active out there.
Do you look to bring those back into the collection whenever you can?
Yes, absolutely. So we work with collectors, encouraging them to consider the O'Keeffe Museum as the kind of ultimate home for their collections. But then we're also increasingly working on the open market, trying to find works that we can acquire. My goal is to have a real representational sample of the major moments and subjects of her career. We're very fortunate. We're 17 years old. We're a very young museum, but we're fortunate to have such a strong start, but there's definitely some holes I want to fill.
What are some of the gaps that...
I'm not talking about that. Are you kidding?
I'm not the artist in our family, so I'm worried about
Yeah, so...
the gaps that you see in her career, which is very long.
I'm kind of not joking. We don't talk about it because I don't really want to alert my competition to what I'm looking at, because I don't want to bid against them. There's enough competition in the market, but there are early works, some of the early abstraction, some of the different things she painted at Lake George that we either don't have anything like it, or our example is small and unusual and doesn't really allow me to hit that point the way I want to. Our collection is comprised of a number of works purchased early on to found the museum, and then a large group of works that were given to us by the O'Keeffe Foundation, the George O'Keeffe Foundation, which was established through the settlement of her estate, which is a very messy court battle. The courts created the Georgia O'Keeffe Foundation with a 20-year lifespan and gave it an assignment to distribute some of the remaining assets to different museums, to manage the home in Abiquiu, and ultimately, after 20 years, close its doors and give everything else to a worthy museum. That happened in 1987 when the foundation was created. The Georgia O'Keeffe Museum didn't even open until 1997. So we spent our first decade trying to prove to the foundation that we were worthy of receiving the rest of the estate, which fortunately for us, they agreed with. And so in 2006, all the rest of the materials that she had kept for her entire lifetime came to us. That included a group of amazing Texas watercolors. I showed you a couple of samples during the talk. We're putting those on view this week, actually. I'm going back to work tomorrow afternoon to hang those. And those are things that she really treasured and held on to and never showed during her lifetime, so they retain an amazing vibrancy and brilliance in terms of their pigments and color. Tricia.
Cody, would you expand just a little bit? What are your thoughts about her strategy to put us off the scent that place mattered all? Why would she pursue that line of thought?
I'd love to, because when I started at the O'Keeffe Museum, I came in as an American art historian who had spent my career working with paintings. And I was going to hang paintings, and I was going to treat it like an art museum. And I didn't care if people didn't want to see an art museum. And the fact is, many of our visitors are as enamored and fascinated by her life, the where and how she lived, as they are by her art. They have this understanding of this amazing woman, and they want to know more about that. And I fought it for the first year. I really was like, no. Her art's what matters. Quit asking about Stieglitz. Quit asking about Juan Hamilton. Go look at the paintings. I've come full circle, and partly that's because what I've learned working with the homes, what I've learned really understanding her life, is just how amazing her example is. She has an intentionality, a thoughtfulness about everything she did. She didn't spare an ounce of energy on something that she thought was frivolous. And that's a really remarkable example, to live your life with such deep thought and care. It's something that I aspire to now, having worked with her materials and looked at that example. So for the first year, I used that quote saying, well, she said, where and how she lived is unimportant. It's her art that should matter. But I really have come full circle. And I think throughout her career, she wanted people to just get the biographical distraction out of the way. She stopped signing her work early on. You shouldn't have to know it's an O'Keeffe to appreciate its beauty. You shouldn't look for the artist's name first. Look at the work and let the work communicate with you regardless of who made it. So I think there's after a lifetime of telling critics, telling the public that it doesn't matter who I have or have not slept with. These things aren't important. Where and how I've lived isn't important. It's my art that matters. So I think, in a way, that is still true. Her art is what matters, but the life is a remarkable life, and it's worth looking at. Yes?
I went down to visit the museum not too long after it opened.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember as you're walking in, you look up to your left and there's this small courtyard, and standing there is this amazing, huge black metal
Spiral sculpture. Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering what inspired her, what was the motivation, what subject matter, what possibly inspired her to do it, and did she like doing large sculpture things like that?
So O'Keeffe really only made 5 sculptures in her lifetime, plus some clay pots. So sculpture was not a primary form for her. She made an early kind of standing figure in 1916, and then in the 40s she made that spiral design that you saw, but it was originally a small piece about this big. And she only made a kind of plaster maquette of it. It is very closely related to a series of drawings and paintings she did of ram's horns. So if you think of that kind of swirling, overlapping shape, it's coming out of natural observation of the natural world and natural subjects. In the late 70s, through the help of Juan Hamilton, she decided to cast all of her sculptures in several editions. And so that spiral was cast in bronze in the small 10-inch version, in a kind of 3-foot version, and then in that 10-foot version in aluminum. And so there's, I think, 4 of those in existence. So it's unusual, but the language, the visual language, is absolutely hers. And I think at the end of her life, she thought it'd be exciting and fascinating to kind of play with scale. Scale was something very important to her throughout her career, taking small things and making them big. You know, I took a flower and I made you look. Taking big things and making them small. I mean, again and again, one of the joys of working with our collection is you have these paintings that are this big that you have to give them a wall to themselves because you can't hang anything near them. They need the space. She's done amazing things. And some of that comes out of photography, the sense of micro, macro, zooming in, zooming out. That's all part of her gesture. So I think Leighton liked to think about taking a 3-dimensional object and blowing it up was interesting to her. All right, thank you so much. It's been a joy to be with you this evening.